There are some whiskies that just seem to fly under the radar for most people, yet they taste amazing and they're great value. So I'm Phil, and I'm going to fill you in about what I think are the best hidden gem, underrated single malt whiskies. So these videos can be controversial, and that's because what does underrated even mean? Like, is it underrated to the average person? Is it underrated to a whiskey geek or someone in the industry? To me, it's a combination of three things. It's the cost, it's how much I hear people talk about it, and it's if the whiskey's actually good. And I know in some circles, these whiskies might actually be quite popular, but I think overall, the whiskies on this list, for the majority of you, you probably wouldn't have tried that often. And also, I'm not going to pick like some single cask rare auction whiskey that there's only 20 of them in the world. Most of these whiskies are going to be widely available, so you know there is a chance you can get your hands on them. So number 5 on this list is the Longmorn 16. And I really do think this is an underrated whiskey. It has become a little bit more popular in some circles these days, especially after Daniel Whittington from the Whiskey Tribe called this his favourite single malt Scotch whiskey.
This is a work of art, and this is simply a fantastic whiskey.
However, I do find a lot of people I've talked to have never tried this whiskey or still don't know much about the Longmorn distillery.
Never heard of it.
And that's why I still think it's an underrated whiskey. So it's owned by Pernod Ricard, who also own Glenlivet, Aberlour. Those are the whiskies that you're very likely to see in a bar or a pub on the shelf. You're not really likely to see this one though, and that's because a lot of the Longmorn spirit ends up in Chivas Regal, which is a blend. And that's why, surprisingly, the Longmorn distillery has a massive output, over 4.5 million litres a year, and so they don't really output much of that into its single malts. However, the Chivas Regal is kind of diluted, it's tamed down, it's for like cocktails. However, I do think this whiskey is made for a whiskey enthusiast. It's 48%, it's unchill filtered, and it's 16 years old, and it's real good value too. I got it here for like $120 in New Zealand. It's also been nicknamed the Master Blender's second choice, so after the whiskey they make, of course, but their second choice for when they're reaching for a whiskey is the Longmorn 16. And I just want to highlight how much I also really love the packaging. It's just such a nice, classy design. It feels luxurious. In fact, this is the whiskey I've actually gifted to people the most, especially to clients. I really like the sort of leather strap at the bottom. And if I'm not wanting to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on like a real fancy kind of Glenmorangie signet, this is the one I'm going to give. Let's have a little taste. So it is a mixture of ex-bourbon and ex-sherry cask. It's got fresh fruit, honey, pastry, and this little like peppery note as well. It's just a nice complex all-rounder Speyside Scotch. There's also an older version of the 16 in like a green bottle. That one's fantastic. I have a bottle. A patron sent it to me. He got it at auction, so that was very generous. I do prefer it a bit better than this, but this is still a solid whiskey. They also released whiskey called the Distiller's Choice, which is like an entry-level whiskey at 40%. I haven't tried that either. Can't comment, but this one here I think's great. So number 4 on this list is the Speyburn 15. And I really think this is an underrated whiskey, and I must admit this wasn't really on my radar until Roy talked about it on the Aquavitae YouTube channel.
So nip out and get this before this one disappears too. This is a cracker.
And so I do think now it's got a little bit more popular. So in some circles, it's probably not as underrated now, but I think overall most people haven't had it. So the Speyburn is owned by Inverhouse. They also own Old Pulteney, the AnCnoc, Balblair, which the 15-year-old was my whiskey of the year last year, and they own the Speyburn. So the Speyburn distillery is apparently in a really cool location, super picturesque. It's like a 3-story building. It's like surrounded by trees. There's this awesome pagoda, and it's like in this glen. And side note, glen just means valley. That's why a lot of distilleries start with the word glen, because distilleries need a lot of water. And rivers have water, so they're in glens. And the stats on this are also really good. It's 46%, it's unchill filtered, it's natural coloured, which it all says on the label. Good work, Speyburn. So let's try some. real classic Speyside, fruity note, floral notes, sweet caramel, spice note, hazelnut, really good. So apparently there have been some different batches of the Speyburn 15, some have been a little bit more ex-sherry cask forward. I do find with this, it's actually got better as I've got through the bottle. The price as well is just such a great offer, especially these days where things are getting more expensive. This is affordable, this is good, and I think it's underrated. So the third whiskey on this list is the Loch Lomond 12. And this whiskey was actually nominated last year for the online Scotch Whisky Awards. But I do find most whiskey enthusiasts haven't actually tried this whiskey, so I do think it's still underrated. It's got great stats, it's 46%, 12-year-old, and it's non-chill filtered. But it is coloured, which is interesting because the sister distillery to this, the Glen Scotia, has the same stats. So there must be something about the owners that they still feel they need to put colouring in it. But aside from that, it's a great whiskey. Like, that doesn't affect the flavour. This one is a really interesting malt, so let's try some. It's got this really nice kind of lemon notes, sherbet notes, some other white fruit notes that you get normally in a Glencairn 10 or an Arran 10. But it also has these kind of like characterful, rugged, more heavier, oily notes that you would find in a Craigellachie like 13. So it's kind of like this almost blend between the two. So I can see that some people probably wouldn't like this whiskey as much, but I think if you're seeking out a whiskey with those sort of light notes, but with a little bit of personality, this could be a great choice. And I think part of the reason for that is because they actually have these like really interesting stills at their distillery. I think they still have traditional pot stills, and the traditional pot still starts large at the bottom, it goes up, and then it has kind of like this sort of curved swan neck as it goes down the line arm. This one has these like straight stills, and then they just go directly straight down the line arm. So they're quite a different shape, and I think that might play a part to why this whiskey has kind of a slightly different characterful nature. So overall, I'm surprised how many people haven't tried this whiskey. I do think it's great value. I got it for a good price in New Zealand, and I think it's worth getting your hands on. So the second whiskey on this list is the AnCnoc 18 from the Knockdo distillery. I know I've talked about this whiskey before, I'm going to talk about it again, and that's because it's just amazing value for an 18-year-old. There are so many 18-year-olds now, and a lot of those higher age statements that are just outrageous prices, but this is one of those great single malts still out there that you can still find at a great price with a high age statement. But I do know it is going up in some markets quite a lot. I do think it has a bit of a cult following with some people. Those people probably also don't want me talking about how good this whiskey is. Be quiet! And that's just because it tastes great, but it's got some great stats too. You got the age statement, it's unchill filtered, natural colour, and it's 46%, and it's all written on the label as well. That's what I love about the label. It doesn't put itself on a pedestal. It doesn't like act pretentious about how to have the finest casks and whatever. It's just to the point. There's some good tasting notes on the back. It's almost too simple in some ways because it almost looks like a sort of pharmacy bottle or something. But I mean, for a whiskey geek, perfect.
Nice.
Nice.
So this being an 18-year-old, and I'm now quite far through the bottle, I do think from experience with it that it is better if you give this whiskey time. It goes back to that saying that a year in the cask is a minute in the glass. So give this around 15-20 minutes in the glass to give it a real opportunity to open up. Especially if you like sip it straight away and you've just opened the bottle and you're like, oh, this isn't that great. Just give it time with these older whiskies. It's got this really nice fruity, dried fruits. There's a nice like sweet and sour mix. It's almost like a plum you've picked off the tree kind of a little bit too early. The sweetness is there, but the sourness is also there. Some of those bourbon flavors coming through as well, like the brown sugar, the mapley notes, and that probably says a lot about it being an 18-year-old. It's had so much time in ex-bourbon casks and ex-sherry casks. You get in a bit of both. Lots of layers. Absolutely love it. So the special mention for this list is the Aultmore 12. And I really do think this is a fantastic, underrated whiskey. And I do think if you do like the Deanston 12 or the Glencairn 10, you probably will like the Aultmore 12. It is great stats, 46%, unchill filtered, natural colour, and it's all on the label, which is awesome to see. It's quite a contrast actually to sister distillery, Aberfeldy, which is owned by the same owners, Bacardi, that does the exact opposite. 40% chill filtered,
unnatural colour,
whereas this is kind of the leveled up version. Really nice, like lemony notes, a lot of white fruit, a lot of malty notes, some biscuity notes coming through. It's quite interesting, right? Like earlier in my whiskey journey, I was seeking out like kind of these like light, tame whiskies, so I didn't get as much whiskey burn. Then I was kind of doing the opposite. I wanted as much flavor as I could possibly get.
More power.
Sherry bombs, peat monsters, and now I'm kind of seeking out whiskies that are kind of subtle, but also complex with layers. And that's what I think this whiskey has. If you let it sit in the glass, give it a bit of time, let it open up, there's a lot actually going on in this light, pale colored whiskey. And that's another thing I really like about this whiskey, is that it's a light, pale color, which really kind of breaks down a lot of the presuppositions that people have with dark colored whiskies.
They think dark coloured means more complex and more rich and has a lot more layers.
And it's not true, especially because a lot of whiskies use colouring in their whiskey. Also, a lot of light coloured whiskies, if you give them time and they have good presentation, they can be a really enjoyable experience. And you get this with a lot of independent bottlings. So it's really cool to see Aultmore release their standard bottling with those stats. So my number one underrated whiskey, the Tormore 16. And I'm pretty confident that a lot of you haven't tried this whiskey. It's got some mixed reviews. Some people do really say this is kind of an unbalanced, kind of weird whiskey, and some people do absolutely love it. So I thought, well, I'll buy a bottle and come up with my own opinion. And the good news is, I do really like this whiskey. It's 48%, it's unchill filtered, it's a great age statement of 16 years, it's a good price. Doesn't say anything about color. It also has a batch number, so it's B1309 is the one I have. Maybe that says a little bit about why some people have not enjoyed this as much as others, as maybe the batches are quite different. So I do know, even if you've driven through Speyside past this distillery, you might still not know much about it. That's because there's no visitor centre at the moment. What I really like about this whiskey, it has this really nice crossover between like those ex-sherry, cask, astringent kind of notes, and those kind of like more tropical orchard fruits, toffee apple flavors. It's almost like you mixed in Glentarret 12 with a Arran 10. There's also some milk chocolate notes, some orange notes, some roast like chestnut notes. There is a bitterness in the finish that I don't absolutely love. And I will say this is not like my absolute favorite whiskey, but I do think for the amount that people talk about this whiskey, I do feel like it's still underrated. And recently a really interesting thing has happened. It's been bought by the Elixir Distillers, which have also started a new distillery called Port Natruan, which is an Islay distillery. And they've bought the Tormore as well. And they actually made a statement. They said, "We foresee a bright future for Tormore. Our goal is to establish the reputation of Tormore on the global stage to match the special quality of the whiskey. We will be refurbishing the distillery, and we will also plan to build a visitor centre." So I do think if you don't like this whiskey, maybe just keep an eye on it. We may start seeing a lot more of this bottling on whiskey shelves than we used to. But I'm keen to hear what you think is the most underrated whiskey. So leave a comment down below. Thanks to my patrons for making this video possible. And above all, make sure you share and enjoy. Beauty.